Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland. On the Majority Report today would have been Michael Brooks's 42nd birthday. And to celebrate his birthday, we're having some of his favorite guests on. And want to welcome back to the program one of Michael's very favorite guests. One of the, I feel like one of the first people who are actually in studio here. Harvey J. Kaye. He is, of course, Professor Emeritus in Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, author of The Fight for Four Freedoms, What Made FDR and the Greatest Generation Truly Great. I think we just had you on with the letter hack for
the comic strip.
The comic strip, graphic novel, I guess, maybe? I don't know. But
we were hoping to get there, yeah.
And Harvey, you were one of Michael's favorite guests, and he loved talking to you. And, you've been on the Majority Report many times, too. But, I mean, we were trying to sort of get a sense of, what would he be talking about these days? It probably wouldn't be radically different from what we've been talking about. But wanted to get your take. I mean, we're in, how unique of an era are we in relative to authoritarianism? And then we could talk about what we need to do to push back on it.
Well, first I'll just say, you mentioned in studio, I always had an arrangement with Michael that if he would say, when you want to come on soon, I say, well, I'm going to be in Brooklyn the next month to visit our daughter who lives in Greenpoint. And so I would end up in studio, which was always a pleasure. I mean, if I were in Brooklyn right now, I would rather be with you folks as opposed to Zooming with you folks. And one of the things that was always the case, I mean, Michael talked about three mentors, Adolph Reed, Richard Wolff, and me. Each one of us had a kind of separate orientation. Adolph was very much a political scientist, Richard Wolff an economist, and I was the historian of that crew. So whenever I was on, Michael would always ask, how did we get here? Okay, and we're talking several years at the least ago when these questions began, maybe 10 years ago. And I remember using the term, well, for 40 years, we've had this creeping, they used to talk about creeping socialism back in the 50s. Well, we've had creeping authoritarianism ever since the 70s and the declaration of war, essentially by capital conservatives and the neoliberals who came into the show around then. And here we are. I mean, we've seen it for all these decades, and basically the Republican Party lives up to the worst expectations. The Democratic Party is hardly relevant and allowed themselves to become decreasingly relevant all these years. So how unique is this? Well, in terms of authoritarianism for the United States, this is actually very unique. In terms of authoritarianism for large segments of the population, no. I mean, we had slavery, right. Okay, then we had the Reconstruction period, which everyone thought might be a moment of real liberation, but then they ended up imposing the Bourbon regimes in the South. Immigrants had their own struggles to get along. Women, of course, always experienced versions of that. But this is in its own way, every crisis, every moment is unique. And in many ways, this is unique because we have done the nightmare version. We allowed ourselves, and I'm not saying you and I are responsible or Emma responsible. We allowed ourselves to elect a man who already indicated his aspirations of dictatorship and authoritarianism. And most people out there either didn't believe him or thought he was comical when he would talk in those terms. They didn't imagine he might actually begin to pursue it. And if you think about the past 6 months, I mean, we are in, this is one of the great crises in American history, I think, really one of the great crises. And the action to get out of this is a challenging one.
I mean, it really, it is, it happened very quickly when we crossed that threshold. I mean, it's like a tough line to see crossed until you sort of see it in your rear view mirror. And, the idea that we have troops on that have been deployed to Washington, D.C., after being sort of deployed to L.A., right? And this stuff with the Smithsonian, with the BLS, with the massive federal police force that ICE is going to create, with the deportations, and making law firms and universities, bend the knee essentially, and so it seems dramatic. And in terms of like a fascistic movement, put aside the authoritarianism for a moment. We've seen this kind of fascism, though, rise in this country, right? I mean, we had the KKK at about 10% of the population in 1920. And we had I don't know how far in the attempt of the coup of FDR we got, with Smedley Butler, et cetera, but where does it rate along along that line?
Along that line, I think this remains unique. Here's what I mean. Okay, if we assume for the moment that he has the MAGA base, as it's called, okay, and I'll be generous and say the MAGA base might be 30% of the American people, although it's probably shifting a bit in light of events. That's rather unprecedented. So if you go back to the 30s, for example, with the attempted coup, to take out FDR, and the attempted coup from above, which that is investing huge sums of money in the 1930s by way of the American Liberty League. The billionaires of the day, the multimillionaires of that time, invested heavily to try to take him down. But what FDR had, okay, and this is to his advantage, and it's not to the advantage of Trump specifically, or ever would have been to the advantage of Biden, is that FDR, by the time of 2 years into his presidency, they loved him. The American working class loved him, whatever reservations they might have had, because he had already begun to show that his party was committed to addressing not just the economic depression, but the inequalities and the authoritarianism of capital. Okay, right away in the first 100 days, we all talk about the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which empowered collective bargaining and the right to organize unions and placed the government at that time solidly behind those efforts. But in fact, in 1933, FDR had already signed into law the National Industrial Recovery Act, which included just those kinds of rights. And sadly speaking, capital found a way around it by way of creating, for a while, company unions. The other thing was that FDR made it clear when he signed the National Industrial Recovery Act into law, he said quite publicly, the time has come for corporations and businesses to pay nothing less than a living wage. Now, these are the kind of signals FDR sent, and Americans mobilized. Hundreds of thousands and millions ended up joining the labor movement. Civil rights organizations actually began to rev up in a significant way in the 1930s. There was a massive national housewives movement that took place when they found that companies were often, trying to jack up prices in order to cover what would have been the higher wages. So in that sense, the tumult of that time favored FDR and the Democratic Party, which, other than the Southern Democrats, had decidedly moved in a direction that, though the term wasn't used by FDR or the Democrats, social democratic direction. Social Security, National Labor Relations Act, housing, across the board, those kinds of dramatic changes. So this is unique because we have a man in office right now who was elected. And, if I can just sidebar a moment, to me, the critical moment was probably when Obama was elected, at least to have shifted gears. If Obama had pursued half of the promises that Yes, We Can implied, we might never have arrived here. Okay.
And just, from a structural standpoint, there was really started when he was the nominee. They began to coalesce power. Specifically the word went out, do not support outside groups. We're bringing it all in-house. And then Obama for America basically was, led into a dungeon, as it were, after. And there was a specific agenda, I mean, a tactic in their mind to disempower the organizing, the populism that had built around Obama.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think it was ever his agenda to be populist, but as evidenced by the fact that they did not want any other power bases outside of the White House to exist. And we ended up seeing the results of that, both in how hard it was for them to get the ACA through, even with ultimately with 60 votes, but also how many elected officials in the states were lost over that time.
I think it was about 700.
A thousand, I think, over the two terms. And, that's why we lost the governorships. That's by 2010, all of that redistricting happened at that time. There was some state comptroller who left politics because they didn't know where to go because the whole bench was wiped out. But so let's talk about the sort of like the what FDR did as a proof of concept in terms of like the electoral power of this, because I think there's we operate, not everybody, but there is one mode of operation where the Democrats are trying to figure out how to win, and they can't figure out how to do it, and they argue that we need to moderate, and but the Democrats know we have proof of concept, right? I mean, even if you look at it the most cynical way, it's there. The people don't realize this. I mean, at least you and I do because we're old. But people in this office, like Democrats controlled the Congress until 95. And I mean, for 40 years straight, they controlled 50 years straight. They controlled the House because of these reforms. And so it's out there. It's just there are certain percentage of Democrats, maybe over 50%, maybe less, who use this question of how do we get elected as a way of making sure, of really saying, how do we get elected with a set of policies that are not going to disempower our benefactors?
Clearly they're all praying for a Cuomo victory or possibly even Eric Adams victory in New York. God forbid that
or
New Yorker.
Oh my God! I'm joking.
I don't know if how do you pronounce that name?
I think it's Sliwa, but I did find out the other day he lives in a studio apartment with like over a dozen cats. So I don't know if I trust that guy fully.
Well, I have a feeling that's a function of divorce.
I've heard New Yorkers who are progressive say, hell, better him than Cuomo or.
Well, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I mean, what's interesting is I'm a generation ahead of you, Sam, but our generation.
Just barely.
Okay. Yeah. Well, to me, you got everyone else has stayed younger while I'm getting older. The thing is that we were taught wrongly about FDR. Americans, of the post-war years, those of us who were baby boomers, so to speak, we were taught that this was all because, FDR was a liberal, okay, and he saved America from capitalism, et cetera. That's what made him great. And they really did not want to make the case that, well, the point is that FDR had said even before he took office that he needed to make America fairly radical for at least a generation. In writing, he had sent to a friend who was like the foremost figure in the field of academic social welfare questions. And then from that first 100 days, immediately challenged Americans to try to live up to that. Now, there's no doubt that at the outset he made accommodations with capital. But when they made it clear they were not going to give way, he turned. And in 1936, and you can imagine how much the working people loved it, he said, at the Democratic National Convention, 1936, in Philadelphia, at a stadium of like 100,000 people, nationally broadcast. He said, they complain, and when he said they, he meant the economic royalists complain that we want to overthrow American institutions. And he said, but what they really complain of is that we want to overthrow their power. And to paraphrase, and guess what? They're right. I mean, he made it clear, however much it didn't happen, maybe as people on the left today would have said, oh, geez, but he didn't do this and that. The fact is, that was a remarkable 12-year presidency. And you're right, not until 1995. I mean, they briefly lost Congress in 1946, but they got it back. And right, all the way through. I mean, even Dwight Eisenhower in 1954 said, when his brothers asked him, who was a conservative down in Texas, when are you going to start doing what we put you in office to do? And he said, anybody, any party that tries to get rid of labor's rights, of Social Security, I mean, he went on and on and on, will never be heard from again in this country. Okay? And then, of course, our generation was involved from the bottom up, so to speak, watching our parents' generation elect the most liberal, indeed progressive Congress since the 1930s. And one advantage they had is that, of course, they had experience, and what they knew to do was to have a president who surprised them, okay, and became the most progressive president since FDR. Again, the war, and I can give you other reasons in which, I have real criticisms of the Johnson administration, but they did institute a second effort at least of approaching a New Deal. And then what did the Democrats do in the 70s? It's like they said, well, I guess it's, we got to turn our back on labor, on the working class, on the FDR tradition. By the way, that included the likes of Gary Hart and in time, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and on and on and on and on. And it is amazing. It isn't that the Democrats, I used to think, well, the Democrats forgot, right? Well, they didn't forget. They literally sold out and were bought up.
Right. Okay.
But here's the thing, and this is the amazing thing that people also don't realize, and I don't know how many times it shows up in the media, they occasionally do make it clear. The majority of Americans still want exactly the kinds of things that FDR pursued and promised, especially in 1944 with the idea of an economic Bill of Rights. I mean, we actually had polling done, those of us who were involved in this project of creating an economic Bill of Rights. And to our pleasure, we found out that, the majority of Americans want essentially an economic Bill of Rights. And at least in the Democratic side of the thing, they really want it. The great majority wanted it. But what do the Democrats do? What do? Sorry, I'm getting revved up here as if I was with Michael back then,
Right.
But what do? They allowed Biden to stay in office, say he was going to run. They then choose or position Harris to take over. Even at the moment where they might have done something, when she chose Walz, they send him out against Vance in a debate. This is like that moment where you see it happening. And they probably told him, just shut up.
Right.
Don't say anything. And that was like the final straw in some ways, because the election was relatively close. But seriously speaking, it's like when people used to say, well, the Democrats really don't want to win. The consultants make more money as losers. And I used to joke about it. And I used to laugh at them and say, come on, don't be ridiculous. But it isn't that. It's that they don't want to lose the donors, period. Okay? And the fact is, we are the majority. Progressives are the majority. And the point now is to try to organize. And I as I sent the note to Brian and to you, look, the left has got to grow up. Okay? We have got to come together around a radical, and I say radical because in this day and age it sounds radical, a radical, call it progressive, I don't care, vision that approaches or actually endorses and embraces an economic Bill of Rights, because it is what Americans want, and Democrats especially want it. And by the way, you can't work without it. We have got to align these progressive organizations with larger and smaller movements. We have got to get labor to remember that in 1944, when FDR called for an economic Bill of Rights, they launched national campaigns in pursuit of it, and they never gave up that vision until at some point they were so smashed, I don't think they could imagine anything after the 70s and 80s with Carter and Reagan. So, I mean, and then last but not least, you have Ro Khanna on occasionally, do you not?
We haven't, but
Well, the likes of
certainly
Ro
familiar.
Khanna, I mean, he and I spoke together a year ago at the pre-convention progressive thing, and I think people like him in the congressional caucus, progressive congressional caucus, it's about time they came out bluntly, not policy by policy, bluntly, and said, in a manifesto-like way to the Democratic Party, this is what we stand for. We stand with FDR, period. And that's what we want.
Right. And then you can hit the Republicans on being the party of the robber barons of the current era. And then you make it a full circle historical kind of perspective here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I got two questions for you. One was one historical and one just referencing what you had mentioned. But let me just start with this. Where's McGovern in that? I mean, I know where Hart is, Gary Hart, and Clinton, and the sort of like rise of the more austerity, corporate-oriented Democrats. But McGovern was, and I've always perceived McGovern as being sort of like he's been smeared as being the hippie choice, and I mean, he was very progressive on a lot of things, but he was somewhat I don't know if he was anti-labor. I guess this is what I'm asking you, because he certainly was, he was in charge of a commission that moved, that introduced democracy, more democracy to the Democrats in terms of their primary process, but also specifically to disempower labor leaders at that time. So where do you put him in? That's the piece I've never fully understood about McGovern.
Yeah, it's really, that's like one of those tragic moments. What happened was, yes, after 68, at the Democratic Convention, they created a commission to examine how candidates were chosen in the party. And McGovern chaired that commission. And indeed, it had to do with primaries and other things. And they set it up in a way that labor's capacity to influence the outcome of elections within the party would be reduced in favor of folks who had been marginalized, for women, minorities.
It democratized it. I mean, it used to be sort of like more of like a smoky back room type of situation.
And that's first to remember that. Well, actually, it's the second thing that George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO, was shocked by. I mean, absolutely shocked. The first one, you got to go back a little further. In 65, 66, a bill appeared before House and Senate. Okay, and the bill was to finally bring an end. Should have mentioned this earlier. An end to the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 that disempowered labor in the sense that it made it extremely difficult, I won't go into the whole thing, to organize in the South, which, by the way, also utterly hampered the civil rights movement, okay, for those years. Okay, so anyhow, the bill it comes up, and it's before the Senate. And needless to say, there's a filibuster being pursued by a combination of especially Southern Democrats and perhaps some Northern Republicans. Okay, so McGovern was from South Dakota, and he didn't know what to do. South Dakota, I believe, had already become a right-to-work state, and he actually asked for permission, I think, from who I don't know. He voted to not bring an end to the filibuster. That began the animosity that labor started to feel for him. That would have changed. By the way, those are the kinds of things that would have changed the course of American political history.
Right. I mean, people have to understand Taft-Hartley was like Empire Strikes Back against the National Labor Relations Act, and really curbed and started the essentially was the beginning of the end of union dominance in this country. It took a couple of decades, but Taft-Hartley really narrowed the ability. It meant you couldn't have cross-sector strikes. You couldn't have strikes outside of shops. I mean, it really limits labor's ability. And if we had gotten rid of that at that time, we'd have a very different country right now.
Yeah, and people often say that it was the civil rights and the civil rights movement, and then the riots of the late '60s that brought an end to the Democratic Party hegemony, so to speak. But if you actually look at the surveys and polls of the period in the '70s through the '80s, when Republicans asserted themselves and neoliberalism emerges as the powerful force in the Democratic Party, most Americans were still saying, the majority of them, they wanted Great Society, New Deal kinds of policies. But the Democrats turned their back on it. Yeah, but so anyhow, so we get to 72 at the convention, and they choose McGovern, and Meany, not all of Labor, but Meany and the AFL-CIO representatives there, they walked out, and they sent a signal that to the Democratic Party that, you can't depend on us in the same way.
And part of that wasn't just a personal animosity to McGovern. I mean, there was a sort of like a cohort of people who would ultimately be known as the Reagan Democrats.
Oh, absolutely.
Who were responding against the emancipation movements of women and of Black people and of otherwise marginalized people in our society. But do we see that strain today with Sean O'Brien and the Teamsters, who are now moving towards the Republic? I mean, this is the sort of the dilemma. Have we alienated labor to the extent at this point, with the Democrats not being the party of the working class, enough that like we're going to have to do something radical to reorient and get back? I mean, there's no returning to the status quo, it seems to me.
No, thank goodness. The scary part is that there is no returning, but that's also the challenge.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, if the Democrats want to go on in the way they have, it's not the end of the Democratic Party. It's literally the end of American democratic life. Okay. I mean, when you have, look, I'm sorry, I'm pulling slightly away, but I know you've mentioned the presence of troops in Washington, D.C., right? I mean, they're there essentially to antagonize.
Right.
Okay. I mean, not all those guardsmen are saying to themselves, yeah, I'm going to antagonize. But that's Trump's intention. Okay. He's looking for an excuse. And when and after the 30 days, I think it was you said it, they're pulled out, he'll go to another city. And he's already implied, what do they call that, dog whistle like way? He'll go to the cities where African Americans govern. Okay. Yep. He'll push it and push it. So, I mean, it's going to take a hell of a lot of patience not to blow. But on the other hand, the Democrats better realize their job is not to moderate. It's literally to get out of the way. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's
no.
But I mean, it's all. And lastly, you said on the left we have to grow up and unite around a progressive or radical social democratic vision. Who's going to grow up? What is involved in that? Like, what do you mean by that?
You may have noted when I sent that message to Brian, I said liberals and liberals and the left. So liberals are going to have to grow up and start and stop talking about simply worrying about, if you like, the politics of it. They're going to have to start realizing that behind the politics of it is the point of the economic royalists. Okay, so it's not a matter of persuading. It's not a matter of how you sell the party. Yep. I mean, think about I don't even know how anyone can bear to listen to what my fellow LSU alum, what's his name?
Carville?
Carville. Gee,
I thought you were going to say Pete Buttigieg, because he's the new version of what we're talking about here.
I mean, I've got my target, so to speak, but yeah. I chose the one that just turns my stomach when I hear him, okay? I mean, those folks literally need to be displaced. They need to be sent home. And, if any Democrat anywhere along the way has acted like a neoliberal in any fashion, we should make it clear we're not going to buy it. But we got to start making it clear now. So I'm talking about, there are still militant liberals, as well as, for lack of a better way of putting it, socialists who show up in various places, and the progressives who have their organizations, PDA, okay, Our Revolution, and others. They need to sit down and say, okay, it's not a matter of compromise. It's a matter of winning. And the time has come for us to organize around, and I use the example of the Economic Bill of Rights because you've had Alan Minsky and Leon, the co-authors of the 21st Century Economic Bill of Rights. You've had Matt Strackbine on and myself, and we turned all of that into a comic strip. I mean, it's got to be around something like that. By the way, it won't be simply around one policy, healthcare for all. It's got to be broader, because healthcare for all may not actually attract the unions that are pivotal to this coalition.
Often they're behind it because so it's got to be a set of principles that so that everybody's on the same page in terms of an agreement on some very basic principles,
right?
And B, so that you can almost give a certain amount of like grace regarding specific issues that are not addressed within the context of those principles, so that you can move forward and organize around some of those narrow principles.
And you guys have to win in New York, okay?
That's
got to be the message, okay? It's something like that.
Yep. Well, Harvey, Kaye, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
You brought a lot of joy and knowledge to Michael. He would cite you often. And we will put a link to some of your appearances on the Michael Brooks Show in our podcast and YouTube descriptions today. Again, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you guys again. Don't hesitate to ask.
Great to
Thanks,
see you.
Harvey. Bye-bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.